Okay, great. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. Thank you so much for coming to UCL, the Institute of Education. My name is Professor Karina Fernley, and I'm really excited that you're here today for us to talk about warnings for mental health during climate extremes. A really big, heavy topic, but we're really hoping that by the end of the session today, we will all come out of this feeling much more positive about future directions and what work needs to be done and can be done. So we're really hoping that this is the start of a really good conversation. So welcome to everybody in the room. Welcome to our guests online. It's lovely to have you here. Please do use the chat to place questions or make some comments, and we'll try and bring you into the event, as this is a hybrid event. So thank you very much for joining us online. For those of us in the room, we are not expecting a fire alarm. So if the fire alarm does go off, as the Warning Research Centre, I highly encourage you to follow the signs to exit the building, because it would be hugely ironic if you didn't, and the end of the Warning Research Centre. So yes, so that's just the main thing there. So yeah, we are the UCL Warning Research Centre. We are based here at UCL. For those of you that are not aware, we are the world's only research centre dedicated to looking at warnings for all hazards, whether that's human-made or natural. And we're really trying to work across different silos, bringing together different stakeholders across different regions of the world to try and understand how to enhance warnings and make sure that people are safer and have places to go that are safe during an emergency. But of course, warnings are all about what happens before that emergency. It's all about the preparedness. So you can see more about us on our website and what we're up to, but we're basically a joint venture between the Department of Science and Technology Studies and the Department of Risk and Disaster Reduction here at UCL. So our agenda today is the welcome by myself, and then we're going to have a wonderful foreword by Professor Virginia Murray. Rhiannon's then going to present the index and take us through the wonderful document that is before you. I'm particularly, for those of you online who can't see it, we've managed to get some printouts here, and just loving the colour scheme, basically, nice and bright and cheerful. And then we're going to have a panel discussion, which I'll talk about in a moment, and then we'll have the opportunity to have questions from our audience in the room and online, and closing remarks, and of course the all-important reception, where we can all have a refreshment and chat with one another. So I want to take this opportunity to talk about Rhiannon, because normally when the Warning Research Centre does these kinds of events, it's usually some eminent professor somewhere who's been going for a long time, and you kind of think, yes, that's this person. Rhiannon is actually in her early 20s, but as you can see from the slide here, she has an awful lot of experience here. So she's currently doing a PhD titled Rain, Rain, Go Away, Come Back Another Day, which, given it's raining outside, is completely apt for today. And she's based at the University of Glasgow, where she's doing her PhD. Prior to this, she did her master's in Earth Futures at the University of Glasgow. And this is how we met, incidentally, because my mentor from my previous job runs the Earth Futures program at the University of Glasgow, and they have a work placement program. So every year we get 2 wonderful students from the University of Glasgow to come and work with us at the Warning Research Centre. And Rhiannon just never left, because she just did the most exciting work, and it was so clear that there was a huge demand for this. So we just kept working, and Rhiannon produced so much work, which is essentially this document, that we were super proud to carry that on and see the value of this work and want to help get this out into the world and make the difference that it deserves to have. So you can see here, Rhiannon is obviously quite young in her career, so we can expect stratospheric outcomes at her inaugural lectures in the future, which won't be too long away, I suspect. But Rhiannon has a solid background. She has a solid background of understanding and working with mental health, disability as well. She's worked as youth representatives, freelancer. She's worked in in a number of different organisations in lots of different ways and capacities. So Rhiannon has a lot of on-the-ground experience that she brings to this report, and that's what makes it so valuable, because it brings the academic with the practical, where the academia meets the road and in terms of the actual realities. So we're really, really delighted to have Rhiannon here today. And by no means our panelists are equally as awesome. As you can see here, we've got Dr. Emma Lawrence from the Climate Care Centre, and she conducts mental health research at the Institute of Global Health at Imperial College London. And on our panel, we've also got Tilly Alcayna, who is the Senior Technical Advisor for Health and Climate Change at the Red Cross Red Crescent Climate Centre, and Professor Virginia Murray, who has a very long list of roles, but I've put the shorter version here, which is Head of Global Disaster Risk Reduction at the UK Health and Safety Agency and Security Agency, and honorary professor here at UCL. So we're really delighted to have our panel. We're also secretly kind of excited that we don't have much gender diversity in our audience today. I shouldn't be saying that, but it is refreshing sometimes to have that. So I just wanted to set the scene very, very slightly with just a couple of slides really to sort of highlight the importance of this work within the warnings world. And we all know that early warnings for all is a huge thing in the world of warnings. It is an initiative that was launched in 2022 by UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, who basically wanted to make sure that everybody on Earth could have access to warnings wherever they were in the world. And this is a great initiative, and it's being run by the 4 key UN agencies listed here: the World Meteorological Organization, the International Federation of the Red Cross, United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction, and the International Telecoms Union. And so together they are working to try and make this happen globally. And all of us are trying to support them in this work, whether we're academics, practitioners, national governments. We're all trying to make the most of this opportunity to take a moment to focus on warnings. But the priority of this initiative is on hydrometeorological, which does include climate, but not quite so obviously. And actually, what we say at the Warning Research Centre is that actually we really need to focus on all warnings for all hazards: natural hazards, human-made threats, and we have to think about those that are accidental or intentional. We also have to deal with our complex, messy world that we live in, with multiple hazard events, cascading hazards, so that's when one event triggers another, and of course all new emerging risks which we don't really understand yet, but we're seeing the consequences of, such as new technologies and of course climate change. So it's a very complicated landscape, but warnings are still very much failing. And some of the work by Professor Ilan Kelman, who works with me in the Warning Research Centre, who's the deputy head, he and I are very strongly advocating for the fact that warnings should be for people, not for hazards. And in that sense, we need to think about the individual and personalising warnings and thinking about how people's circumstances are when they receive that warning, but also understanding that our circumstances change over time as we're in different locations. I mean, I'm sure many of you have perhaps never been to UCL before. You're not familiar with the environment as I know it really well. So if there was an emergency, we would react differently as to what we need to do. We also have different resources and capacities to respond. And we're also at different stages of life. Particularly if you're a woman, you might be a child in your teens, then you might be pregnant, you might be an elderly lady. All of these different stages have different vulnerabilities to them. So we really feel like actually multi-hazard sort of warning concept doesn't really capture this. We need to be thinking about vulnerabilities and serving the whole of society. And so Ilan and I came up with a concept in a paper recently published about all vulnerability warning systems. And I think it's important just to highlight this because it really does feed into what we're talking about today. And so our main essence is that since a disaster is a process that's caused by people's vulnerabilities over the long term, and warning systems are actually very social and societal processes need to enhance these and work with them, they need to be implemented over the long term with and by people. And that means focusing on the vulnerabilities. And we feel that such a system would be an actual genuinely warning for all kind of warning, actually, that serves everyone on their own terms to cope with different hazards and multiple hazards. And this is important because we've got to think about the individual in this, which is kind of weird when we're talking about hazards that can affect hundreds of thousands of people, as we might be experiencing right now with Hurricane Melissa that's hitting across Jamaica and the Gulf there. So these are things that we really need to be considering now. And just to sort of think about this in terms of how we're bringing academic disaster risk science to support this idea of vulnerability, well, different people can experience an event in different ways. So, if there was a flood, Ilan Kelman, for example, would be able to grab his go bag and run out the door straight away, as I would have to think, where is my daughter? I need to grab her. I have a different vulnerability because I am a mother and I have a child, right? And I have a responsibility. So we kind of have that different experience. But then at the same time, it doesn't matter whether it's a flood or an earthquake or a pandemic, I still have that vulnerability that I have to care for another person. And so it's really thinking about those vulnerabilities that are really at the heart of all this. And so we really also need to be thinking about why people are not responding to warnings. This is a really big topic at the moment. Why do people not respond? Well, maybe they don't understand, maybe they don't have the capacity, or they don't understand the impacts on them, or they don't want to think about it because it's quite overwhelming. So we really are hoping that this vulnerability warning will help shift some of this focus. And what's really important is that actually part of thinking about vulnerability, when we think about people, right? And core to us being people is our mental health. It's a critical part of this process. There's been some work on the health side and thinking about health in terms of disaster risk reduction. There's been a lot of work by Virginia and team, but it's still not quite coming through. But even more quieter is this sort of mental health side. So we're really hoping that today is going to help start kicking off a really good conversation about this. And so really we can see in this diagram produced by Emma, who's in our panel, that the interaction between hazards, so we can see the impact of global temperatures, we might be seeing more types of extreme events. This can have immediate impacts on our loss of life or physical damage or damage to nature. And then we get the long-term impacts that might come from conflict and war or disruption to health systems. And of course, all of this is a tremendous amount of things to take on board when you're trying to live your life, care for others, and sort of put food on the table, and it's going to impact your mental health and well-being. So fundamental is this aspect that we are going to be looking at today. So it really is my absolute pleasure to welcome all our panelists and speakers, and I'm going to pass over now to Virginia, who's going to give us a bit of an insight around warnings for mental health during climatic extremes with her experience and wisdom. So thank you very much.
Rhiannon, well done. Rhiannon, I know you've worked incredibly hard, but so have you, Corinna. It is so important that we all work together to try and build knowledge for areas that we're really concerned about. And it's such a privilege to be here today. Somehow, Rhiannon, you pulled me into your net. And I love the fact that young PhD professionals beginning their career can find people to really inspire. And you inspired me. And I just thought it was really important to, at your suggestion, to come and try and support you a little bit today, when I know it's your day, not mine. Corinna, you've mentioned Melissa. I just feel this image is so shocking, so worrying about what's happening in the Caribbean. They're going to have a very difficult time, and we've been really concerned, even when I pulled this off the screens on Monday evening, about the fact that there's a huge problems of floods, landslides, and everything else. So I grabbed this to remind us that early warning for all is absolutely essential, and looking at vulnerability is increasingly important. So to talk about vulnerability, we did a paper a while ago where we looked at vulnerability to flooding health impacts. Yes, we know about children, we know about pregnant women, but it's the physical, sensory and cognitive impairments that are so important, and understanding what warnings mean. Even for the elderly or those with chronic illnesses, we're concerned about the homeless who don't get this information. And we need to be aware how vulnerable they are, and think about cultural and language-based vulnerabilities and the trouble with weak social networks, all these things that communities matter about, which is why having the Red Cross, Red Crescent here is so important, Tilly. And some people just don't want to know. You know, they really don't want to know. So they have little awareness, they're not interested, and they may be in a very high-risk built environment. And I just wanted to add tourists as well, because often tourists have no idea what's going on around them, and they're going off to visit a site and they just say, oh, why is that shut? Or whatever. So there's lots of problems that happen. So just thinking about vulnerability, it's really complicated. And we did a lot of work on floods to pull this together in the work that we were doing on the health effects and prevention in the WHO European region, which was a really useful document because we came up with what are the direct health impacts of flooding. Now, you've looked at this in your report, what are the direct, and taking Emma's work, it's absolutely key. So drowning is what we all expect, but there's also physical trauma. And indeed, in Jamaica, only last night, they reported that people had been electrocuted and killed, trees had fallen on them, in the preparation for being ready for Hurricane Melissa. So we know that there's a huge number of problems, that when you put people under stress, things can go wrong at many levels. Water shortage, chemical contamination, heart attacks, and infectious diseases. And one of the things we've known from flooding is that you can get heart attacks for a very long time afterwards, unfortunately. But the indirect effects are also important. Carbon monoxide poisoning has been huge. Oh, and the effects on mental health, well-being, acute and long-term. But also the reduced access to health services. If you can't get there, you can't be treated. And you have the disruption of your livelihoods and income, which Jamaica is talking about already. So I want to take you to some work we did in December 2013 to February 2014. We had really bad floods. Amazing how the nearer it got to London, the more important it was. I don't know why, but I think Parliament might be there. Anyway, the outcome was that there was a wonderful English national cohort study on flooding and mental health, a cross-sectional analysis, something that I think was really important. A cohort study, which cross-sectional analysis of these neighbourhoods that had been flooded, and the validated instruments to screen probable psychological morbidity, but also prevalence and odds ratios were calculated. So a good epidemiological study. And one of the authors, the first author, was one of my registrars, Tom Waite, who is now the Deputy Chief Medical Officer for England. So people are aware, even in our world, that these things really matter. So Tom did a huge amount, and this was the outcome. To me, it is horrible, the impact on people who are flooded. But we also know it's awful, the impact on those who are merely disrupted. And the impact on those who are not flooded is still pretty worrying, because there is inevitably a level of burden from mental health anyway. And I thought it was really important to share this, Rhiannon, to make sure that we knew why this vulnerability index of yours is so important. Now, the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction is absolutely key, and you've mentioned it already, Corinna, and we know that there's a lot of effort to try and reduce impacts through our global targets and to increase knowledge and improve early warning. And we found that with the Sendai Framework Monitor, people really struggle to understand what all hazards really is. So we did a huge piece of work across the UN Office of Disaster Risk Reduction with about 40 different UN agencies, International Science Council with many networks, with the Insurance Development Forum representing industry, and indeed the International Federation of the Red Cross, Red Crescent. Thank you. We can't do it without communities. Your input, Tilly, is always vital. And we had lots of volunteers, and we reached out to many. And when we had published our first versions of the hazard information profiles, we were really delighted that in the midterm review of the Sendai framework, it was described as groundbreaking, the work we had done. So incredible. And then, of course, there's the next problem is you go and get asked to update it. So it's on the table here for anybody who feels it's a lightweight touch thing, you know. You just need a porter to carry it for you. Thank you, John. You did really well lugging it here. But it's really important that we deliver this. And of course, it's all available online. And if you want the QR code for this global resource, then please, I've got it here, but we can share it later. We now have 281 hazards. So those all hazards, Corinna, that you're concerned about, include the hydrometeorological, the extraterrestrial, and space debris and all sorts of things, the chemical, the biological, plenty of those, Tilly. The technological, from cyber to transport to waste to other hazards, the environmental ones like wildfires, desertification, salinity, all sorts of horrible things. The geological ones that John led on, which was just incredible. And for completeness, we were allowed to include the societal ones. And then the societal ones, the only one we have with mental health officially as a primary hazard is the suicide cluster. So apologies, mental health is usually a secondary hazard, a consequence. So I just wanted to show you very briefly flooding, as flooding has been such an important point. And it's only 5 pages, it's quite brief, but we have this thing about parent and child, the complex and cascading hazards, which I think, Corinna, you've raised so well. So we know we have the drivers of flooding. What is the parents that drive floods? But also, what can the floods then do? It's not a fully complete document, but it's the first time we've tried to show this graphically, and I hope that you'll find it of interest. So to me, the work you're doing, Rhiannon, is all about the Sendai framework again. And this incredible commitment that was supported by all UN member states when they adopted the Sendai framework in 2015, to support recovery schemes. Oh, we need an index to be able to recover. We need to measure what the problem is, to provide psychosocial support and mental health services for all people in need. Rhiannon, well done.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much, Karina and Virginia, for introducing this session so wonderfully today. And I love the fact that there's so many people here. I was half expecting just my lovely family, which of course are delightful to be here. They're sat at the back, and at the front as well. I was just expecting my family to be here to an empty room. So it's really, really nice to see lots of experts and other people who are just generally interested, like I am, in mental health and climate change. So today I'm just going to present to you what I've been working on for the past year and a half. So yeah, who am I? That is actually a good question, because sometimes I even question that myself. But my name is Rhiannon. I'm a PhD researcher at the University of Glasgow. I advocate for the Royal College of Psychiatrists. I've done a lot of areas, including climate change and mental health, but I also work in autism advocacy, and I developed the National Autism Training Programme for higher clinical trainees, which trained over 1,200 psychiatrists in England. So I do quite a lot of stuff. I've been working in this field for some time now, and basically I do actually have a spare time, believe it or not. I do make spare time. It's not that much, but it's something. And like, I do love crocheting, so people who know me, please expect something crocheted for Christmas, because I'm on a bit of a autistic-styled obsession with it right now. I also like cooking, hiking, and just generally singing. I guess that's the Welsh blood in me. We love singing, all of us. So this is what I'm going to discuss today. So if you do decide to nod off or zone out, this is kind of the structure, so you can zone back in the right time. So, as Karina and Virginia put it very, very well to us, that climate change is having an increasingly and exceeding impact on mental health. So much so that the most recent AR6 report from the IPCC stated this following quote: "We know it's serious. We know at every 1 degree rise, the suicide rate increases by 1%. We know people who are exposed to flooding are 6 times more likely to develop a mental health disorder during a climatic hazard. We know that people who have dementia, people who have psychosis, are 2 to 3 times more likely to die during a heat wave. It's not ideal. We're not in an ideal situation right now. And persons with disabilities are 4.4 times more likely, again, than non-disabled people during floods, are 4.4 times more likely to develop a mental health disorder. So they're 10.4 times more likely than a non-flooded person. Speaks for itself. So, where did this all begin? That is my lovely university, the University of Glasgow. I took that on the 2nd of January in the new year. I thought I'd welcome in the new year very nicely. And as Karina said earlier, I took part in an internship scheme as part of my master's program. Fortunately, she couldn't shake me off, and I think now we're friends, and I don't think she's ever going to get rid of me. So basically, Karina was like, you can do what you want. That was the first conversation we ever had. I was like expecting a job description, and basically she was like, what do you want to do? I was like, what do I want to do? That's a good question. And basically, I did some reading. I was like, well, I'm doing my PhD on climate change and mental health, so maybe do something about that. Then I thought, whilst I was reading, the index came about. I was looking at indices, I was looking at matrices, and I was like, where is a matrix to measure this? I kind of expected it to exist. It seemed like an obvious thing. There was an index for malaria risk. There's indexes even to measure the risk of an individual developing schizophrenia, for example. But there's not one to measure the risk and the vulnerability of a community to developing a mental health disorder during a climatic hazard. Something that is becoming increasingly important as we go on. So, I embarked on a wonderful literature review to try and work out what I needed to do. And as it says on the slide, opening a can of worms, because it was like opening a can of worms. It was a nightmare. I was trying to find literature that frankly did not exist or was hard to find, and I managed to try and salvage it into a lit review, which you can see before you in a report. It required a lot of digging, it was messy, it was complicated, and it was hard work. But we got there. And basically, I reviewed and included 55 articles. I did a systematic review. I didn't know what a systematic review was before I started. And Virginia was like, have you included a Prisma diagram? And henceforth, here is my Prisma diagram. I learned very quickly that I needed to do this because otherwise I'm not going to be taken seriously. So it was a massive learning experience for me. But basically, within the literature review, what was included within my findings was government reports, policy documents from both institutions and academic research centres, and case study examples carried out by academics. One such example was a paper by Smith et al. In 2017, which included the investigation into using community-led warning systems in developing flood warnings for the Karnali Basin in northwest Nepal. So worked with the community to develop both a technological and a societal-based warning system. So I learned quite a lot doing that, and it was fascinating. And how I found my articles was going through Scopus and Weather Science manually. I didn't have any of these fancy systematic literature review softwares which can wrangle 300 papers out of nowhere. No, I had to sit there for hours and hours and hours, changing all my search terms like accessible early warning systems, or disaster risk reduction and mental health, or just early warning systems in general. And yeah, it was worth it because I ended up coming up with these following findings and recommendations. So I like to draw out a diagram, a visual illustration. Because I'm dyslexic, I find it quite hard to be like, these are all the points, because they're all interconnected with one another. And I found that climate change early warning systems were quite common for like flooding, drought, wildfire, so on and so forth. What I found was that mental health wasn't really integrated into this whatsoever. I was like, okay, great. I found that disaster risk reduction mechanisms have mental health and psychosocial support care. Some of it is very good. Some of it is not so good. Some of it is long-term. Most of it is short-term and immediately after, which is fine, but not so fine when the mental health impacts of climate hazards often onset later on because of the secondary outcomes of household insurance, for instance, the stress of finding a new property, the stress of cleaning up, the stress of having to get young people to school again, and stress of being able to find a job if you've lost your job because of flooding. So by the time you actually need these, they're either gone or there's no funding for them anymore because they're a trial as a part of a research project. So it's not really ideal. I did a lot of reading on indexes, and I found out that indexes were commonplace for vulnerability, general vulnerability like socioeconomic vulnerability, for malaria, for dengue fever, but not for mental health and climate change. That was quite a resounding silence. In terms of what I also found out was that basically persons with disabilities, women, elderly people, young people, for instance, weren't considered or understood as well in terms of their vulnerability, in terms of how they are sometimes much more disproportionately impacted by the mental health impacts of climate change. There was very little literature showing those disproportionate impacts, which was very scary, because as someone who is disabled and who is a woman, I believe really strongly that my community should be looked after. And it actually was really disconcerting, because I was like, there are people who are going to suffer more so than because of these ongoing effects. And it just felt wrong. I felt angry about it. I'm passionate about these things, okay? Once you get to know me, I can be a very argumentative person. Anyway, but I also found that kind of people of colour, for instance, or people from the global south have accessed these mental health mechanisms, but they're not designed within the cultural context or the cultural settings. And these perpetuate further epistemic violences against these communities through Western constructs of mental health. That the mental health is merely clinical. It's not considering the cultural needs of how mental health implications emerge. It doesn't understand that. It's like, right, you go on a clinical regime, you take this medication, you listen to this CBD therapy, which doesn't take into account these social behavioural norms. And that can in fact further perpetuate violence upon these people, leading to further disproportionate impacts. So after that really positive kind of review and finding, I also uncovered, I forgot to mention, that there was wonderful warning systems for climate, but a lot of them are top-down. They're amazing. But the problem is the Met Office is like, here's a warning. But, okay, great. What does that mean for the community? Does that actually mean anything to me? Should I care? Most people don't know. They just look at that text message and they're like, grand. Well, that doesn't really fit into what I mean. That I don't understand that, or can't access it because they have a visual impairment, for instance, because they're not considered and it's not developed in the context of the community. So basically what I decided to do was develop an index to measure mental health vulnerability, because I felt it was important that people finally understood those secondary impacts and they have longer term consequences, but also it can help address systemic mental health inequalities within this country, and also help innovate research further within the social sciences and the physical sciences. Okay, an index might seem technocratic, but we need a mixture of science, technology, social science, arts, maths, to be able to work. Climate change is not going to be able to resolve itself merely just in the sciences or merely just in the social sciences. So having a base to start, an evidence base, to help guide researchers into developing interdisciplinary studies was really important. So I embarked on my quest to build my index. This is the Matterhorn. It's a very high mountain in Switzerland. It's actually known to have one of the highest death rates in the world. Only 5,000 people have climbed it, but 600 people have died trying to summit. And there's also rumoured to be a snow yeti climbing around, according to Swiss folklore. And basically my journey to the top of the Matterhorn was like that when I was building this index. I encountered a snow yeti, I encountered definitely hard climbs. It was not easy. Matterhorn is actually ranked higher, more difficult to climb than Everest in certain parts because of the technicality. So you think Everest is hard, well, this is actually harder. So yeah, that's what I had to kind of deal with, and I was like, great, got to build this now. I've come up with this idea, right, let's get on with it. So, what is the Mental Health Vulnerability Index, you might ask? Well, basically, it's there to help communities, societies, governance structures, academics understand the vulnerability of a population to developing a mental health disorder during a climatic hazard. Climatic hazards such as flooding, such as drought, such as heat, such as wildfires. It's great that we consider heat, but we often leave out floods. We often leave out droughts. We often leave out other climatic hazards, especially within international governance structures and indicators. So basically, the Mental Health Vulnerability Index aims to show a localized kind of reflection of areas of highest vulnerability to kind of policymakers. But it also shows which areas could benefit from further mental health support before, during, and after a climatic hazard. Because the thing is, if we make sure that these structures are in place, that the community feels supported, the likelihood of distress will decrease. If people feel prepared and know they're being adequately supported and the support is available right away, we can lower vulnerability. But also, mental health changes all the time. It's very dynamic, just like the climate. The climate changes all the time. Our moods change all the time. Our circumstances change all the time. So it's really important that we constantly monitor this because it makes our NHS systems much more versatile to change, to mental health change. We're dealing with a mental health systemic crisis in the NHS now. We don't have enough psychiatrists. We don't have enough beds. We don't have enough doctors. We don't have enough general care practitioners. I see this in my work at the college all the time because we're not adapting. We don't understand the adaptive dynamic nature of mental health. And having a scoring system like this might help that, to be able to direct resources, to be able to invest effectively in infrastructures, and to be able to research further in areas of greater need. This is how the risk index is structured within 5 sections and then several subsections. I felt it was really important to include the natural environment because daylight, for instance, geology, land use change, really amplify the likelihood of an extreme emerging. We don't often realize that, or a mental health disorder emerging. Seasonal affective disorder is real. Daylight. If you have a flood in winter, you're probably going to be far more prone to developing some form of depression or anxiety, not just because of the actual hazard, but also because of the amount of daylight you're experiencing at the time. So it's really important. But this is not the panacea of all our problems. I'm not here to solve and be the truth seeker. This is the start, okay? It's not perfect. I built this model, and it's a composite index. It just draws together lots of different indices, lots of different data sets into an overall composite score. So it's just the start. I'm not proposing this to be the overall solution. And I don't want to come in here today giving you all these marvelous promises that it's going to change everything. I hope it does, but it's not guaranteed, because I'm a realist in terms of that kind of situation. Anyway, but why is the Mental Health Vulnerability Index based in Wales? Well, some of you met my family who've come here today. My parents have worked very hard in the NHS in Wales for a very long time, and my Auntie Anne has as well. And seeing them work and talk about their stories, about the struggles of the care system, about poverty, deprivation, socio-economic inequality, and how hard they've worked for this country is really important to me. And I don't practice medicine, but I saw it as a way of giving back to my community. Because the NHS needs us in Wales. It's underfunded, it's chronically understaffed. We have all sorts of policies, which I won't go into right now, which some very small minority of people agree with, but most of the common majority disagree with. And there's a lot of pressures there and could benefit from a tool like this. Second off, Wales is not the healthiest of places. Yes, it is extremely beautiful. It's very scenic. Please come and visit. The beaches are gorgeous. The mountains are gorgeous. The Welsh cakes are great. The people are also very funny and lovely. But at the same time, we have some of the highest health care needs in Europe. 12% of adults and 18% of children are in chronic persistent poverty in Wales. 23 in 100 people have a mental health disorder. already. We also have some really high suicide rates. If Powys, which is number 3 on our map, was a country, it would have the 4th highest suicide rate, not just in the UK, not just in Europe, but in the world. 26 per 100,000 people have taken their own lives in Powys alone. Because of its rural nature, because of stress and pressures, because of lack of healthcare, it's a serious problem, and it's going to only get worse in the face of climatic extremes. This is the situation now. I dread to think what it's going to be like if we don't do anything. So having this tool will help healthcare authorities understand that. I also chose Wales because, conveniently enough, it's actually split into health boards. These are health boards. There are 7 in Wales, so it gave me really nicely split up areas which I understood the dynamics of. I knew how they worked. It was a really helpful structure to be able to split the data. And Wales actually has quite a lot of healthcare data. It's actually pretty good, believe it or not. You'd think that Wales wasn't that great at data collection, but it actually is. And their healthcare data is really well structured into all the health boards, which made it really great to develop and test an index, because I knew exactly all the hospitalization rates in my local health board in Iron Bevan. I knew all the prescribing rates per 100,000 people. It was really well split up. It was very clean, which made it slightly easier developing this tool. So, what you might want to ask is, how many indicators are in this index? There are 47. Mental health is not a simple thing to measure. There are a lot of causes. Oh, sorry. And I wanted the data to be open access. We have a massive data inequality problem in this country and globally, where people cannot access data because it's behind paid firewalls collected by multinational corporations who are not willing to share it. I wanted people to be able to build this tool themselves, adapt this tool to when they need it, and be able to use it without cost. It's really important that we build tools for people to use during this time. Climate change is a collective problem, and we must have collective solutions. And I don't want inequalities to emerge between communities on the basis that they can or cannot afford data, access to data, and have the right access to data sets. So I wanted it to be open access so the Welsh Government could afford to implement this as a tool, but also other governments and countries across the UK can. And also, the reason why for 47 is because mental health is extremely complicated. It can emerge out of many different things, and climate change is also extremely complicated to understand as well. So having to merge socio-economic indicators such as numbers of disabled people, numbers of elderly people, numbers of people aged 12 to 25 because they're much more disproportionately impacted by climate emotions, merging kind of economic indicators such as the Welsh National Index of Multiple Deprivation, education rates, employment rates in terms of employment sector, I found was really important because certain sectors are disproportionately impacted by climate change. Going on to hazard exposure, making sure that all the hazards that Wales experiences were accounted for, such as wildfires, floods, droughts, heat waves, making sure landslides, we have a lot of landslides, believe it or not, making sure that they were all considered and the intensity and the frequency of those per year was measured and modified. I couldn't do it for any later because sometimes it was pretty hard to find that data. And then population health, that included prescribing rates of antidepressants, that included hospital beds per 100,000 people, the hospital admission rate per 100,000 people, to better understand what the current present burden on mental health systems already exists. We need to know that because if we have a flood, and then in 6 months' time, people need to be hospitalised, what are we going to do if we don't have enough beds? They'll be sent out of area. They might be sent out of Wales. And that perpetuates problems because you might have a 3-4 hour drive to visit your uncle, your dad, your mum, who's been hospitalised. And that perpetuates mental health problems for longer. Young people who stay away from their families are shown to be hospitalised for 20% longer than the people who are housed and are treated at home. So it's really important that we get this right. Natural environment, in terms of geology, understanding the porosity of soil is really important because porosity of soil impacts overland flow and the absorption rate of water. Understanding daylight is really important because that influences depression rates. Understanding how the land is used. If you've got a highly urbanized area, you're going to have a lot of surface runoff. So the risk of flooding is going to increase. And if the storm drains get blocked, great. That's not ideal. And then health and general infrastructure resilience. So how many doctors do we have per 100,000 people? How many general healthcare practitioners have we got per 100,000 people? It's really important because we can train people to deliver mental health care through basic first aid training. I've had first aid training and I actually support people. I know I don't do a great job. Like, I'm not a clinician of any sorts. I'm not God. I don't have a God trick. I am not a clinician, but I know the conversations that I've had with people have encouraged people to go and get help and direct them in the right way. So making sure that community leaders are trained to deliver mental health first aid is really important, and having doctors who understand that is really key. So hence why all the doctors are included. And general infrastructure, such as community centres, such as roads and power. Even though we're classed as a global north country and we have full electrification, what if we lose the electricity? That increases risk of anxiety because people are having to try and find power to charge their phones. We're actually having this discussion in a Scottish Government project that I'm working on. People are like, well, yeah, I'll just check my phone. And we're like, well, what if you run out of power? Where do you get your phone numbers or your contacts? Where do you meet people? If you need to find an evacuation centre, how do you communicate that? And they're like, oh gosh, I don't know. So having an understanding of kind of power provision is really important. But there are potential difficulties at using this tool. And it's not the panacea. It's not going to fix everything. Okay, I'm a realist here. And I know that it's a tool and it's a start in understanding this, because mental health is complicated. It might not cover everything, for instance. It might not be 100% clear. For instance, it's kind of a simplification of reality because it's a competent index. Certain areas of health boards might be better off than others. So certain health board might have greater levels of need than other health boards. Some people might live closer to hospitals within that health board than others. So those people might have a lack of care coverage. But I wasn't able to shrink the data sets to lower super output areas. So they're kind of like boundaries for political elections and used for like index deprivation, because the coverage of health and mental health care data wasn't available for that, unless I spent like 2 years trying to work out a tool to work that out to then build this, which, as someone who was trying to write a master's thesis and start a PhD when I wrote this initial index, wasn't able to do. I was actually writing this methodology and my master's thesis at the same time. Don't ask how I survived. Let's just say a lot of coffee and a little bit of level of insanity. Proxies had to be used. That's because certain data sets weren't available. For instance, illiteracy rates in Wales aren't measured, but levels of no education in over 16s is measured. So I had to use that instead of using exact illiteracy rates. We don't seem to collect that. I know we are a country which educates everybody, but that's a presumption that we shouldn't take for granted. Time, like I indicated before, I developed this whole initial concept with methodology within 6 months. It would require a lot more time to work on it, which I don't have, which is why I'm presenting this to you guys today to discuss, talk about, and develop further. And data production. Wales, yes, has good data, but it's out of date, some of it. It's like 2-3 years out of date. We need to make sure that we have accurate data sources because it's really important so we can keep track of these things. So yeah, sorry to like shoot my own index down. I felt as if I needed to do that to show a balanced argument. I don't want to be biased in any way. But it does pose significant opportunities. Yay, great. Such opportunities, it helps indicate areas which benefit from anticipatory warnings. Great, anticipatory warnings are warnings in advance. Having warnings in advance means people can prepare, people can get ready, people can be aware of mental health support before the hazard happens and make sure that they know where hospital care is available, make sure they get their prescriptions, make sure they have their grab bag ready to go, they switch their electricity off and get ready, which could really help. Also, the warning could provide some healthcare information. about where to get prescriptions if you have to evacuate, or where the nearest hospital is when you're functioning, when you're evacuating, or just here's some actual well-being tips on how to just generally cope. Just to take a deep breath, because it is overwhelming. But then also help inform warnings and how they're actually communicated. Because if you have a population which has high vulnerability, saying to them that you are at risk of danger, this is terrible, and having horrible loud alerts can actually stress people out more, which puts them at greater risk. I've learned this quite a lot during my Scottish government research project. We've been doing interviews with people, and they're like, I don't want to listen to horrible things saying that I'm going to die and I need to run away from the apocalypse because it terrifies me. I get really stressed when I read, you need to prepare. It feels overwhelming. So maybe not using such strong language can influence behavior, or using different sounds to indicate the warning being alerted, not to scare people, because it's a scary time. People are under a lot of stress as it is. So having a different way, using music, for instance, convey warnings in a better way could really help and not overwhelm people and put people at greater risk. So the future. This picture is actually in Nevin, which is on the Llyn Peninsula. It's where my mum and my aunt grew up. And yeah, they experienced a lot of coastal erosion and landslides. So I thought I'd stick that up. I thought it was a nice picture. And basically, there are a lot of opportunities here. Like I said earlier, I haven't built the model yet. I've developed the methodology. I haven't had the time. I'm not Houdini, okay? So I would like to be able to build this model and make it interactive. People can play around with it. People can look at it on the internet. People can use it in their day-to-day lives. I don't want it just to be held in academic circles or in policy circles. I want people to know and understand their risk and vulnerability so they can do something about it. They're active agents. Another thing is I want to make this tool accessible to young people and persons with disabilities. I want to make sure that young people who already experience significant stress from climate change have access to a tool where they can understand their own risk. For instance, Caroline Hickman, who's a famous psychotherapist at Bath, did a study on UK children in 2022 with Save the Children, and 60% of the children interviewed said they were very worried about climate change and they felt it was already ruining their health. So having a tool which gives them the opportunity to be able to convey that is really important and understand their own risk, but also persons with disabilities, so they actually understand their own risk as well, making sure it's able to be easily read, making sure that people understand and have agency over their own choices is very important because that reduces vulnerability. Promote amongst policy settings. This was designed for policy in mind. I made this to answer some of the Sendai framework, priority 33.0. I felt that was very, very important. And I would like people to use this tool to basically mark out vulnerability, measure adaptation, be able to understand kind of capacity to cope with the mental health implications of climate change. So please promote amongst policy settings. I have developed it for that reason, with that in mind, because I want decision making to be easier for people, and this can help with that. But also, I believe thoroughly that the tool that I've created, yes, it is great, but it was designed with Wales and the UK in mind. It does not consider other countries' healthcare systems and how they work and cultural constructs of mental health. I believe that I am not the right person to do that because I'm not from that country. I don't have the knowledge and I don't want to enforce those extremes on people. I understand that this tool is beneficial, but I believe it's important that people have an opportunity to build a system that suits them. I don't want to enforce further violence and construction and inflict further violence, upon countries who already face further challenges with climate change because of historical legacies. I believe that's really important, and I don't want to perpetuate that. So this is built for Wales and the UK. But if people want to take the initial model and adapt it and work it into their own cultural context, their own settings, their own governance structures, that's amazing. I'd love to hear about that. But I do not want people to just universally apply this, because I don't think that's the right thing to do. And finally, I want to embed this within disaster risk infrastructure in terms of making sure that the NHS and emergency services are actually communicating with one another to help policymakers who make decisions, right? I want to make sure that the decision makers have the right tools at hand. They are aware of these risks and these vulnerabilities, and they can mitigate those. But also educate young people, educate the community about the risk and vulnerability. Because if people are aware about these risks, they can do something about it, and they actually help themselves. And it means that we don't have to come in, they don't have to get distressed as much, and it could actually really help reduce burdens on healthcare systems. So, closing remarks. It was born out of a gap. I saw a gap, took the opportunity and ran with it, because we need one of these. It's inevitable. We're facing so many climatic hazards and extremes, and it's only going to get worse. But also, I just wanted to show how populations can be vulnerable, and systems like this can occur. So we need to prepare for them. It's not a perfect tool. It's not going to solve all our problems, but what is perfect? Okay, all tools have their caveats. And I feel as if, as someone who's autistic, I will just say the honest truth. Okay, I will tell you the pros and cons. So I just wanted to make sure that people were aware of that. And also, it provides an opportunity, a step in the right direction for research, for policy, to be able to guide future studies, to be able to guide community-led initiatives, to be able to guide individuals, to be able to take agency and action about climate change. So thank you all for listening. And if you'd like to get in contact with me, this is my email address. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rhiannon. That was very insightful and a great overview, and will help us with our bedtime reading tonight. You can take all your documents back. So we've got some references here as well. So now I'd really like to invite our panelists to come up and have a panel discussion, which Rhiannon's going to be leading, so we can sort of dive into this a little bit more and think about how this index can be used and get some reflections from our panelists. So. Okay, we are glad to say that everyone here is increased their mental health by having a nice cup of tea and a drink, which is very important to keep us refreshed, hydrated and focused on the event. So we hope that you online have had an opportunity to do that now, and I will hand over to Rhiannon.
Okay. Thank you guys for listening so well. I hope I did not bore you. I hope you learnt lots, and I hope you enjoy reading my report. So we're going to just have like a quick panel session here to go through kind of the relevance of the index, how it could be used by different policymakers in different contexts, but also to field some questions from yourselves in the audience, both here and online. So in terms of questions of what we're going to ask, to start off, just for everybody in the panel here, welcome. Thank you so much for coming. I appreciated it. So in terms of the first question, I was just interested to find out of all of you, from your perspective, how can you situate the Mental Health Vulnerability Index within wider climate change and mental health research?
I'll go first. Hi, everyone. My name's Tilly Alcayna. I work at the Red Cross Red Crescent Climate Centre, which is basically a think and a do tank for the whole of the Red Cross Red Crescent movement that you might be familiar with. So it operates at international, national, and then highly localized areas. And we have the greatest volunteer base of any organization in the world. And that's what makes the Red Cross Red Crescent really, really great, is that there are community members who are volunteers who maybe access extra training, but have that highly localized understanding of the community that they are part of, that are then part of this bigger movement that can kick into action, say, when an emergency happens. And I think what is so key about this is that I just said when an emergency happens, but it's so important, like Rhiannon highlighted, all that work beforehand in the preparedness of helping the communities know in advance so that they feel empowered, so it's less of a shock when a crisis does happen, because maybe you have prepared the go bag, you've checked in with your vulnerable relatives, you have a plan, so it isn't as destabilizing as if it comes out of absolutely nowhere. And so that's the kind of bit that I want to highlight the most, is that the aspect of preparedness and where this index can sit, and then within climate change and mental health research and practice being of more importance to me in the Red Cross Red Crescent, it is overlooked so much in the preparedness phase, in part because of funding and a greater attention to a sort of more reactionary approach when it comes to emergencies. But everything that we can do beforehand in that preparedness phase is super, super key. And I would just love to see so much more in terms of the tailoring of the warnings that we heard about, and figuring out how to empower communities so that mental health and well-being can be better preserved before, during, and after a crisis, and not only in that moment of crisis.
Just go down the panel. Is that clear to everyone? Perfect. So we're introduced before, but just as a refresher, so I'm Emma Lawrence and I'm Director of the Climate Care Centre. So we do research at this nexus of climate and mental health, and try to always make sure that that research is providing evidence that will move the dial in policy and practice and will make a difference for people kind of on the ground. So this is very much of the ethos of what Rhiannon has created. So I started work at the Nexus of Climate Mental Health, very similar time to Rhiannon, about 2019. And, you know, I really resonated with what Rhiannon was saying of sort of imagining things must exist somewhere and then finding out that they don't. And needing to put things out in the world that start a conversation and bring all of the different people from different places, from different sectors around the table in the way that Rhiannon is doing. In terms of situating this within the wider research landscape, so one of the things that the Climate Care Centre's worked on in the last years, including actually with the Red Cross Red Crescent Climate Centre, is an initiative called Connecting Climate Minds. Some of the people in the room, hi Sasha, were also involved. And this brought together people from 126 countries, over 1,100 people in a series of dialogues, both in person and online, really, to understand what these emerging needs were on the ground of mental health in the context of the climate crisis, and also what decision makers needed. So this were people with lived experience, but also medics, policymakers, humanitarian workers, civil society, and researchers to say, well, what evidence is needed to respond to these emerging needs? And what we hear from people around the world is the stories of these experiences that Rhiannon has described, and how different those experiences can be understood and expressed, and mental health being understood in these different ways, as we've heard, but also how policymakers and practitioners might want to respond. But there is this huge gap in knowing, okay, if we understand the problem, but what are the solutions? And so when I started work in this space, really just getting people to join the dots between climate and mental health was a big thing. But now we've sort of progressed to the point where a lot more people, including policymakers and decision makers, understand that there's a problem, but they don't have the solution. And part of that is that we don't have the way to measure progress towards a solution. So when we've looked at, there's interventions and support that already exist in different cultures and different contexts, but they're not being evaluated, they're not being therefore scaled up and invested in. And it's not clear to decision makers all the time that if we invest in this area over here, like greening our city, that we're going to get this mental health benefit over here. And so how do we do that cost benefit analysis when so many of the solutions for mental health come in the other areas? And so one of the reasons I think this index is so important is because it starts to paint that systemic picture of this systems understanding that mental health as this outcome depends on all of these different factors, as Rhiannon has described. So, for instance, having this environmental aspect of it, saying, well, actually, if we change the environment in which people are living, that's going to change their mental health vulnerability and have these, therefore, these kind of cost savings later on, as well as all of the human aspects of that. So it's really important that we have tools like Rhiannon's that are starting to be developed to say, okay, how do we start to go from beyond there is a problem to how do we measure this, monitor the mental health impacts, and also monitor the benefits of investing in climate action for changing the vulnerability of communities, and targeting limited resources to the people that most need it. So it's really, really valuable. I'll talk more when we come round to the next questions about how I see this, but yeah, really well done, Rhiannon.
Thank you very much.
Rhiannon, thank you. I just wanted to mention a peer-reviewed publication that I thought was really important. Somebody was flooded. She couldn't sell her house, and she became frantic every time it rained. And she became so anxious and so worried that she couldn't quite manage. If rain makes you feel you could be flooded tomorrow, do you know, that's awful because we need rain. So it's balancing all these things, and Emma, your point is so important about how we understand how we might measure this. Now that we've done the hazard information profiles, maybe, Rhiannon, we need to build vulnerability information profiles. And to me, your vulnerability index for mental health is a really important step to consider how we can communicate and measure these things. And I know you point out the fact that it's for Wales and for the UK, but the principles are something we could use everywhere. And how we understand this, to pull it together to see if we can deliver something that will be more globally useful. And how we can try and plan for how we could protect somebody from being really frightened every time it rains. We must do more.
Well, thank you, Virginia, for that really thoughtful insight to end those kind of reflections. And I really appreciate, Tilly, you touching upon kind of the elements of preparedness and helping to guide volunteers and helping to ensure that the right preparedness is in place before hazards take place. And I'm so pleased that all of you, the three of you, think that this tool could be really useful, because I honestly admire all three of you so much. So thank you very much for your reflections. And Emma, exactly in terms of the environment, that's the main reason why I put it in, is because people don't consider that in vulnerability very well, that we all live within connection to nature. Even though, like, within Western ontologies, we kind of have this nature, society, human binary, we are still connected to the environment, whether we like it or not. And we need to realize that to be able to develop solutions. So thank you all for giving such insightful reflections. So now, Tilly, I'm just going to ask you a question now about how can the Mental Health Vulnerability Index be adapted or used in more complex settings with varying vulnerabilities? And then what are the biggest challenges of that?
So yes, humanitarian contexts are extremely complicated in that you'll have potentially climatic hazards occurring at the same time as, for example, conflict or violent situations or highly politically precarious situations. So that's already like a very, very difficult environment to be living in and then also to be operating in. And I think that is one of the great things of this index, is all the multiple layers of trying to pull them all together and see these overlapping vulnerabilities to build up the bigger picture of everything that is going on, and that monitoring aspect that is so important. Often, in lots of the contexts that we work, mental health isn't particularly well spoken about, it's highly stigmatized, and also, as Rhiannon pointed out, it's so different in different cultural contexts, and how it is dealt with is very, very different in different cultural contexts. So that's where I really, really appreciate this emphasis on this index is a beginning and needs to be adapted to all these different contexts. So that is where the essences of it could be taken and then adapted as makes sense for highly volatile conflict-affected situation. What else do we need to consider in terms of social vulnerability there? What about connections to the environment? What happens when people are displaced multiple times? And then one of the biggest challenges, I guess, around this, that you faced also in Wales, so it isn't just, it is high income, stable locations as well that have it, is when trying to build these indexes and to kind of quantify and monitor in some way, data often is the thing that we need the most and is often lacking the most in humanitarian contexts, because either, the health facility may have had the records, but maybe they weren't digitized and then has been targeted and so destroyed, so that is all lost. Or it was never gathered in the first place. So data would be one of the biggest issues, but I don't want to always limit ourselves to thinking, oh, we don't have the data, we can't monitor this, because there are so many other proxies, like you mentioned, that we need to be thinking about, like what could make sense if we don't have access to that kind of data. And that's again with the power of when you really have people that are embedded in the communities, part of the resilience of the community, they can be the ones that are also thinking and monitoring through perhaps even more qualitative information to say, like, we know that our access has been reduced because all these funding cuts that we're seeing all over the world have been cut. Any support that we previously had is now gone. That might be an indicator already, like it is a chance that we'll see worsening mental health outcomes in these areas. So all, I think, being innovative and adapting wherever we can and taking the essence, but then thinking through in our highly challenging contexts, how can we still try our best to monitor this, because it is so, so key. Thank you, Rhiannon.
No, thank you, Tilly. That was absolutely brilliant, because that was so thorough in showing kind of the complexity of conflict and humanitarian situations. And yeah, one of the main challenging elements, I suppose, of building this tool was to consider all the overlapping relations and trying to put it all together. And having lack of access to data, you bringing that up is crucial. That is one of the most important things that we need to consider when building and collecting, is to make sure that it is possible to get these data, and proxies are a great way of doing it. And I think qualitative research is often, yes, the way to go, just talking to people, believe it or not, community knowledge and just talking sometimes jumps that barrier and that gap. And I think it's a fantastic way of overcoming some of the challenges that we have in understanding mental health, is just actually having those conversations with people, because people just like to often put mental health in kind of this clinical silo and not consider the day-to-day impacts on people and actually ask them the questions which need to be asked. And so, yeah, thank you for addressing that so beautifully. So I'm going to move on to you now, Emma, now to like kind of build a bigger picture in terms of like global community elements. So what is the global community doing about mental health, in the context of climate? And what's next within these intergovernmental organizations such as COPs, the WHO, and climate adaptation?
Yeah, thank you so much. Put the spotlight back on me. So I'm just going to try and summarize where the global policy kind of landscape is with this and why this kind of tool will be so valuable within that. So Climate Cares did the first ever mental health focused event at COP26 in Glasgow. The first 25 COPs didn't mention mental health in any official side events, even though, as we've seen, there is this big mental health impact. And health in general has had more and more involvement in the last COP. So there was the first ever health day at a COP. A couple of years ago, there was the COP28. COP is called the Conference of the Parties. I know there's people here from various different backgrounds. The UN framework on the Convention on Climate Change is basically brings together, it's called the Conference of the Parties because it brings together all of the different country representatives to negotiate about essentially what we're going to do as a collective global community, to what the governments are going to do to take action to prevent the worst outcomes from climate change. And human health is really the ultimate outcome of those negotiations. But until a couple of years ago, it wasn't centered in any way in those negotiations. And so it's great that now WHO has been much more involved and there's been this health day, but still mental health is often the poor kind of little sister of physical health. And so a lot of most of the money, most of the research, most of the action has gone to like infectious disease spread and other physical health issues, which also have, as we saw in the pandemic, a huge mental health aspect to them and interrelationship. And we know that there's huge comorbidities, but again, mental health is still has been often missed. So it's been great that over the last few years we've been able to push mental health with other partners more and more into those spaces. And what's happening this time around, so COP this year is going to be in Brazil, in Belém, and they're really focused on action and on implementation. So there's an action agenda that's being developed, and there is a health aspect to that called the Belém Health Action Plan. And Connecting Climate Minds has been the mental health group that's been part of ensuring mental health is within that action plan. So I've got 8 actions now in the draft, and we're advocating, we've got to try and get countries to keep them in there. And also there is, alongside that, there's the global goal on adaptation is being kind of negotiated, which is a whole suite of indicators to measure progress on climate adaptation. So that means preparing communities to make sure that the worst, when climate hazards hit, that the outcomes aren't as bad. So all of this kind of preparedness that we're talking about, and making sure the conditions are right so that as the climate changes, people will be better protected. And again, we worked on the mental health indicators within that. And the mental health indicator at the moment is about really related to this. So it's about enhancing recovery schemes to provide psychosocial support and sorry, I'm reading the wrong thing. That's the Sendai framework. The Global Goal and Adaptation Indicator is the extent of implementation of mental health and psychosocial support, preparedness and response for climate change sensitive events. So it's really about this mental health and psychosocial support, preparedness and response in the context of these climate change sensitive events. If that goes through, fingers crossed, and the countries agree, the next stage of that will be saying, okay, how does that actually get done? How do we actually measure that? What's the guidance that gets given to countries to evaluate that? And they're going to have to report on that. So it's an opportunity to work with countries to make that happen. But one of the challenges, again, in mental health and getting countries to adopt this is that it's often, there's a lot of data gaps, but also there's a lot of tailoring of what do we have that works in order to understand mental health in these contexts, in order to measure this. We're working with WHO, but this kind of modular tool where you can take these, what data exists, what are all of these different things that we should be looking at, how do we take that and tailor that to those different contexts and kind of use that modular nature to build something that works and has these different aspects to it in these different settings is really valuable. So being able to build on the work that Rhiannon's doing and take that into these the biggest kind of global policy spaces of this will be really valuable. So that's one thing. The other thing is that the national adaptation plans are what countries are doing at a national level rather than this sort of international level. And we've done an analysis with United for Global Mental Health, and the majority currently, so 58% currently don't include mental health. And again, when they do, it's mostly about the problem rather than any sort of solutions. And so again, having something where we can go to people and say, this is a way you can start to measure this and also start to measure where you need to take action. Because the flip side of this is that if you've got these vulnerabilities, it's helping target where you can take action. And so I think that's just really important. just seeing whether there's anything else I was meant to talk about. I think I can probably wrap up there for now, but yeah, I'm happy to answer any more questions as it evolves, but it'll be great to kind of make sure that we bring this into those multilateral spaces.
No, thank you so much, Emma, for summarising Conference of Parties in about 5 minutes. That is an excellent summary of how you managed to bring that together, because that is not easy. And thank you so much for showing the audience really clearly how this tool can actually be really beneficial. And to be honest, I didn't realise the extent of how useful that could be. So thank you for also showing me. I'm also learned quite a lot myself there listening to you explain all that. So I can't wait to discuss that more with you afterwards. So now I'm just going to move on to Virginia. Virginia, yes, I know. You've got to answer another question. And you are very, very experienced in this field. So I was wondering, how can we work to enhance mental health awareness and consider disaster risk reduction, Sendai, in the development of beyond 2030? We have all these mechanisms, like the World Meteorological Organization have this early warnings fall till 2027, and then Sendai is until 2030. But it's not exactly like climate change is going to go away, is it? So do you have any insights or valuable suggestions for us?
No. We know that the Sendai framework goes up to 2030, along with the Agenda 2030 for the Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris Agreement. But it will have to be negotiated what happens next. And the UN is in a slight state of flux, as we all know. And to me, the United Nations has offered an incredible network for everybody to engage and deliver really high-level thinking and support for how we deal with these really complicated issues. So Rhiannon, it was a most fascinating time to have been the vice chair of the Science and Technical Advisory Group, having joined the group in 2008, to see that the delivery of the Sendai framework contained more health, more science than any other UN landmark agreement, even more than the Paris Agreement. But what is wonderful is that it marches with the SDGs and with the Paris Agreement. And what we have in there is such a powerful set of the commitments of understanding the risk, the governance, the investing, and how to build back better. These really strong messages of the Sendai framework, all of which resonate with the need for understanding how we can build our resilience. And everything you've talked about already, Rhiannon, and Tilly, and Emma, have all linked to this word of resilience. How do we make ourselves more resilient? Because the future will not be so easy. It hasn't been very easy in the past, but things are changing very fast. And every piece of work that I've done with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change really shows that the pendulum of extreme events is beginning to swing further and further and further. And part of that is recognized by the UN Secretary General's call for action on extreme heat, which came out in July 2024, where the mental health concerns were raised yet again, and now we have to act on them. But by raising this index, we have an opportunity to try and measure the impacts so we can deal with it better. Thank you.
No, thank you, Virginia. That was a really, really good and frank reflection, because sometimes people just say stuff which has got no meaning to it, or is not quite the truth. So the fact that you've been so truthful is great. So we've finished our kind of like pre-prepared questions, so to speak. So this is your opportunity, audience. If you have any questions for me or any of the other panelists, please feel free to raise them. Karina, shall we pass the mics around and be able to take any questions? So if anyone has any questions for either myself or the rest of the panel, which we can answer, that would be wonderful.
Don't all go at once. Brilliant. Okay, we'll start over here. Thank you.
Thank you, Rhiannon and panel. That was amazing. I was wondering, so you were talking about children and young people, mental health and climate anxiety generally. If you were to develop, and this isn't my area, so I'm sorry if this doesn't make sense, but if you were to develop a mental health vulnerability index specifically for children and young people, are there like extra things you'd add in? Does that make sense? Yeah. Oh, sorry.
No, that's great. A great question. In terms of a young person's index, I would definitely add stuff about social media and about engagement on social media. I would add stuff about school pressures and understanding education, friendship, in terms of connection to other young people, to be able to talk about things, because resilience is often built up by forming connection with one another. If we don't have a sense of community, people won't be able to support their mental health as well. So definitely for children anyway, but also in terms of knowledge and education. Education is critical. How aware are the young people about climate change? How aware are their teachers about climate change as well? Because that is the knowledge that they have to be fed on for the next generation. Do they feel prepared? That would be an area which I would cover in terms of touching upon education, touching upon jobs, touching upon experiences at school would be kind of indices that I consider. In terms of children and young people, in terms of mental health and clinical elements, there are data sets on kind of hospitalisation rates, mental health disorder rates in the UK, and they are quite detailed. So it would be possible to build something like this, and it would work quite well. In terms of doing that as well, it would just require more adaptation and consideration of other elements of like youth engagement with climate change as a thematic. Does any of the panel have anything to say? Emma?
Thank you. Yeah, I think it's a great question, and it really, I guess it opens up and speaks to what we've all been talking about, of this full like continuum of experiences of mental health that are relevant in the context of the climate crisis, but also the multiple pathways that can interact and compound to lead to those outcomes. Because sort of you mentioned sort of climate anxiety and that kind of awareness being a big part of it, but also that interacts with how taken care of, do young people feel that the adults around them are prepared and are going to take care of them in that context of hazards coming now and what they see as a secure future or not. So there's sort of a positive cycle that can be created where if we're helping build those emotional resilience skills into education and into using these kind of index to develop like the preparedness of communities, that can actually alleviate some of that risk of distress, as Rhiannon's saying. But also for children and young people, there's a whole range of other things just based on the fact that they're young, that means that these risks can be higher. So for instance, if a pregnant woman is exposed to like an extreme storm or extreme heat, etc., during pregnancy, or when the infant is very small, that child, even though they may have no memory of it, is then more likely to have problems with behavioural disorders and mental health challenges, etc., later on. So again, there are these kind of temporal aspects to these risks, and similarly with things like food insecurity. So, and then also if your family has to move or your parents lose their job, etc., and your family is under stress, if you're experiencing a traumatic event in childhood, that's a greater risk than if you experience it as an adult when you're just neurodevelopmentally in kind of a different space to deal with that. So, and just the frequency of the number of times that happens as well. So it's a very complex thing to start to unpack, which is amazing that Rhiannon started to kind of lay that out and then to be able to look at that. But I think that, it will be really valuable in the future to start to look at, the particular vulnerabilities of these particular groups, but also how these things interact over time and that kind of longitudinal risk across like the developmental kind of perspective over the life course, which Rhiannon's touched on in the report more widely as well from the literature, where there are gaps, but there's also these interesting things emerging that just fundamentally show how interconnected everything is, that Rhiannon referenced how a paper looking at how climate anxiety increases with loneliness, for instance, and social connectedness is at the heart of mental health resilience and also at the heart of climate resilience. And it comes back to this investment in communities. But until we can kind of show these links and show these composite indicators, then we can't often move the dial of getting that investment that would then generate these multiple benefits.
Thank you.
Thank you. We've also got some great questions online as well. Should we take one more from the floor and then we'll do another one online? Thank you.
Thank you for a great session and for this work. I just wanted to ask what your vision is, I suppose, in terms of next steps, if that's not too broad a question.
No, that's fair enough. So in terms of next steps, well, kind of to build this model would be a next step, actually to have it built and try and make people as widely aware of this tool as possible. Because frankly, the more kind of awareness we have that this is a possibility and an opportunity, the likelihood of it being successful will increase. For sure. As someone who's also doing a PhD in multiple research projects as well, it's quite hard to measure like kind of the likelihood of the temporal scale of how long it might take. It might be more likely a work that I take beyond my PhD, like after as a postdoc, for instance, working on this to expand it and build it, because I'm only human and I can't be expected to be in like 10 different places at once. But also generally just trying to just basically make people aware that this exists, getting it on the like as big a scale as possible, and then having the opportunity to build it both in Wales, but also start that kind of process of making sure that we can work it into different contexts would be great. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. That was going to be my question. Was timing.
You finished. Well, you've lubricated some thoughts really, but and they might not be all that coherent. But I really was just going to make the point that evidently this is this is an area of interest, isn't it? And there could potentially be so many partners that could work with you in terms of other academic institutions. But also, I was thinking about piloting it with local authorities, or indeed, many other opportunities where this could be taken as a blueprint if you were to have some kind of willingness to help you sort of build, or whether it needs to be that sort of top-down built and then it can be engaged with. But yeah,
I mean, it all depends on how much engagement it gets. I mean, if people are not interested, then it will probably take longer for me to be able to have the chance to be able to build this. But I mean, if public interest is there and authority interest is there, it might be easier, but I can't myself, for my own well-being, take on this alone, because it's been a lot of work, and I have to also complete a PhD on time within my 3-year funding period. And I don't want to lose priority from that, because I actually really like my project and I'm really enjoying working with the communities and doing the literature review and engaging with that Scottish local level. But it all depends on engagement and interest and general support. And if people are wanting to support and help do this, I mean, that opportunity might speed up, because time is of the essence, I guess.
Quite as much needed, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely. But that's kind of my viewpoint at the moment. I've got to make sure I look after my mental health and well-being as well, and be sensible with that, because I haven't had the best mental health in my past, so I don't want to lose that kind of time. I've got to make sure I look after myself. But more broadly, it's just interest and whether people want to be able to support that. And if people are willing to fund me to do a postdoc to do it, I mean, grant. I'm all for that.
That'd be a great proposal. Thank you.
Thank you.
Right, we've got some questions online, so I'll start with a big one. So some of them have already been answered about what are the next steps now. So we've kind of covered that. But I like this question a lot, which is, if you were given £1 million to be spent improving mental health due to climate change, what is the key thing that you would do? So that's a question to each of you.
Oh, wow. That's quite the lottery, I guess. I quite like that. Great question. I mean, well, for instance, obviously use that money to hire a data scientist to part build this would actually probably be a good start, and actually find out the areas which would benefit from this money, the budget which is left over, then basically to be able to target. And then I would fund community, local level intervention projects which work with local healthcare infrastructure and services in those areas, basically, and schools and young people, as well as adults and areas of high socioeconomic deprivation, basically, to improve resilience. That would be one of the main things, not necessarily targeting the clinical elements of mental health, because a lot of kind of mental health triggers emerge from kind of environmental engagement. So kind of thinking more holistically about it as a systems approach. That's what I would take with my £1 million. I don't know what you guys would say. Tilly?
Can I up it to 1 billion?
$1 billion.
I feel like 1 million might go very, very quickly. But between 1 million and 1 billion or more, then from the humanitarian perspective, I would absolutely focus in on all the context beyond the Red Cross and all the other humanitarian organizations. But wherever there is humanitarian support, or if we could extend it, but we're very constrained, they're just ensuring that there is greater mental health and psychosocial support, and from like all stages of the disaster risk continuum, not only again in that recovery phase, because I think that is something that is like critically missing, and it would be appropriate to the context from somebody of that context who understands it well with all the training. Somewhere between 1 billion and 1 million or more.
Yeah, thank you. Again, it's really, 1 million would go extremely fast, I think, though I would love it if I had like 1% of that. So I'm just going to answer it in terms of in the different areas. One is that I know researchers always say more research is needed, but this is an area where it's such a nascent field, and there's really critical evidence gaps that are holding back policy and practice, because we speak to policymakers even in the UK and they say, we get this, we want to do something about it, but where are the evidence-based solutions? And so a big part of that is having the right frameworks and the right ways to measure, but it's also about connection. So it's about how do we create the infrastructure to bring together people from different disciplines, different sectors, different countries, to elevate up what's already working, but make sure that's paired with researchers to go in and evaluate what's already happening on the ground around the world, and make sure that that evidence reaches the highest levels of policy and practice, to make sure that that is scaled up and implemented, both in terms of tracking the mental health impacts, but also in terms of making sure whenever climate action is happening, that the risks and benefits for mental health are being accounted for. So Connecting Climate Minds was one example of that, of trying to bring together people from around the world. We have a global online hub if anyone wants to check it out and actually connect with people who are doing this, and all the different tools and resources. But I think that connective infrastructure for the climate mental health space is actually really, really important, because we have these communities of practice now around the world. There's a lot of people who are very enthused about this work, but Rockefeller did a big report on climate and health funding, and they recognize that mental health is one of the areas that is of high need. No one's funding it, and no one plans to fund it, essentially. There's a few, like Wellcome's put some funding in, including into Connecting Climate Minds, to start it, but there are these huge funding gaps in mental health. So that infrastructure is really critical. If this field is also going to progress in a way that is equitable, and it's not just the high income countries and settings that end up doing this work, which we've also seen where the vast majority of research to date has been in high income contexts, or by people in high income contexts going into low and middle income contexts, not necessarily from the ground up there, though of course there is some. But if I was to look at what we know works best based on the solutions now, it is just to recognise that climate action is mental health action the vast majority of the time, and also climate action is enabled by building psychosocial resilience. So if you want to protect mental health, green your cities. If you want to protect mental health, embed mental health into climate education within school settings, and you're building that resilience of those communities, increase the opportunity for people to take action collectively and build stronger social bonds. The difference we heard again and again, and we all said, between people coping or not after a disaster was whether they had someone to help them. And we all know that in our own lives, but that is really what you see from people's stories around the world. And so, yeah, investing in social connection, investing in green space, all of these things that are vital for climate adaptation are also vital for mental health. So that is like where you're going to get bang for your buck, but it's just making sure that that investment comes.
Thank you. I love the question. Love your response, Rhiannon. Very local. Tilly, make it much bigger. Why not? Emma, how we do it for policy and practice, and the fact that funders aren't funding it. To me, I could quite happily spend that $1 million. One of the other groups that I chair is the UNESCO CoData, Data Policies for Times of Crisis, facilitated by Open Science. Tilly, you raised the point about data, disaggregated data, data to measure the impact. Your vulnerability index for mental health is a way of trying to understand what we need to do. Do you know the UN, yet again, this wonderful organization, has called for the data for the decade of science for sustainability. And the work that we've been doing with UNESCO to build data policies for times of crisis facilitated by Open Science in 2026 will call for pilots. Pilots to show how we can improve our knowledge, how we can show that by working together, we can deliver something that can really make a difference. Your index, I believe, Rhiannon, your approach, Tilly, your understanding, Emma, of some of these issues would make it a wonderful opportunity to pull together some really extraordinary pilots from around the world of how we could show that we can work together to deliver improved mental health understanding and hopefully reduce some of the impacts that you have been showing right from the beginning of your work, Rhiannon. What an opportunity. Let's see if there's a donor.
Thank you. And that's really good, actually, because we've got 2 questions here that relate to this particular topic. So maybe I'll give both and you can just have a little quick answer to those. So one of them is, wondered if you could comment on some of the data gaps that exist and what are the key things that we need more data on. And the other one, hang on, is here, which is, would there, as a continuation of the findings of the report, would there be a focus on solutions using the index? So we've got the data gap, the solutions, like examples of good practices or pilot programs that operationalize the index findings with a disability lens. So questions there around the use of data and the solutions based on the index. Just 2 little questions for you there.
They sound very small. That is quite, they're quite large. But I appreciate the audience coming with some fantastic questions. I mean, in terms of the data gaps, there are a lot, I have to say. I mean, I was only able, really, to be honest, to put together the index in Wales because Wales was probably one of the only devolved countries in the UK which actually had everything that was needed. And which I wanted to do initially in Scotland, because Scotland was where I was doing my PhD and it would make sense. But SEPA had a data breach and lost all its data. So I couldn't actually build it in Scotland. And England's healthcare data, NHS digital platform is great, but it's actually quite difficult to navigate and find everything, as well as Environment England's kind of platforms and environmental data is all very hard to find. And this is in the UK, a high income country. Heaven forbid, if I did it somewhere else, because I doubt that I'd be able to get everything, frankly. So in terms of mental health, in terms of the detail, in terms of climate, in terms of measurement of hazards, for instance, you can't even begin to measure how big the data gaps are. And there are solutions coming out of using AI, machine learning, weather forecasting systems to predict malaria risk, for instance. But frankly, in terms of actually pinpointing specific data gaps, it's so hard to do that in this one question. I don't know whether you all kind of agree with that. Tilly is definitely nodding her head yes, in that because there are just so many gaps. Knowing one exact spot to start is difficult. I don't know whether any of you have any other comments on that.
Well, if I may, I think so with the advances in like satellite imagery and Earth observations and stuff, our knowledge of where hazards will occur and sort of like exposure of extent of flooding, etc., that's all quite good, but then it's all the social stuff. And then especially in humanitarian contexts where perhaps populations are displaced multiple times, moving in and out, or then as soon as you get to more informal urban contexts as well, where then it's very difficult to ascertain what is happening, and anything to do with, I guess, lots of undiagnosed, I mean, you can speak to this more, but undiagnosed mental health conditions, for sure that'll be a big issue. And then in our context as well, anything like prescriptions or access to those kind of services or the specific needs that people have, that often just won't, it's too dynamic and changing too often, that there might have been a snapshot at one moment in time, but the conditions and everything will have changed so quickly. So I guess that's a really challenging bit, the temporal part of it, and then also all the like actual social elements of it beyond just our ability to say, this is the hazard profile of this area, but it's about the people and their vulnerability and exposure that is key.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's largely been covered, to be honest. But yeah, mental health kind of gets talked about as a monolith, but as we've seen, you know, there's multiple spectra from, you know, suicide is quite well reported globally, but there's still gaps in terms of underreporting, in terms of stigma, in terms of also how frequently it's measured. We don't have it at the kind of temporal frequency that would enable us to really look from a modeling perspective of always like linking it to specific events, for instance, and understanding, you know, does this vulnerability index have predictive power over what happens around these different events? Some of those outcomes, are still hard to measure. And then there's the more medical side of people living with a whole range of what could be classified of different mental illnesses, but then also the wider population level kind of emotional distress, different cultural experiences, including specific ones like solastalgia and climate anxiety and these kind of things that have been emerging in the literature, which aren't mental illnesses, but are still relevant to the sort of encapsulating mental health and well-being in this context. And the vast majority are not measured in standard ways globally. There is work, for instance, the WHO has a mental health atlas, and you know there are mental health data sets globally, but there are big challenges, there are big gaps, and both sort of in terms of spatially, temporally, culturally, there are real challenges. But it is definitely, as Rhiannon said many times, not wanting to make perfect be the enemy of the good. And so making sure we start somewhere and that we start with what we have. And also thinking about where it can be done. So looking at these, so the Lancet Countdown for Climate and Health, for instance, originally were only looking at global indicators, things that they could measure only globally on climate and health. They're absolutely brilliant work to track the impact of climate change on health and make that really clear. But then mental health was really, really difficult, and they couldn't really do that for a long time. And now they've got these different regional offices and starting to look at, well, maybe we can't do that globally, but can we do that? What is available in these different regions? So again, starting somewhere and then building that up, and then also using that as a way to say, well, actually countries, if you want to be prepared in the context of climate, you also need to be measuring these other outcomes. And again, using some of the climate action as a mechanism to maybe put some of these things in place as well.
Virginia, do you have any?
Just to say that I think that the opportunities are here now to do more, and that we should be doing it. And trying to pull this together using the Sendai framework, the Paris Agreement, the SDGs is key. Knowing that you're going to Belém and that we have the Lancet Countdown report coming out tomorrow. So there's lots of opportunities. But well done, Rhiannon. You've done an amazing piece of work and stimulated much thought and engagement today. I do congratulate you. And Corinna, for making sure it happened. Thank you for including me on the panel.
Great, thank you. It doesn't look like there's any more questions in the room. Oh, you've got one. So I think we've got just like a couple of really short questions. Is that okay?
Yeah, because I wanted to answer the second part of that question initially.
Right, okay.
I couldn't think in my brain about answering the first question and then answering the second question, and I kind of got a bit lost after the first question. So what is the second question again? Because I feel terrible not answering this person.
Solutions.
Because I want to make sure I answer as many questions properly as possible.
Oh, hang on. Oh, sorry. 1 second.
Will you use it in the context of solutions?
As a continuation of the findings of the report, will there be a focus on solutions using the index, such as examples of good practice programs that can operationalise these findings with a disability lens?
So in terms of using the index for solutions, I think it provides a massive opportunity, because it will be able to show kind of reduction in scores. For instance, if the case studies had good practice, if the case study works effectively, it can show and be able to be like, okay, well, if you know that this region has this effect, and then you go in and implement kind of a example within kind of a intervention, let's say, in that specific area, and then you're shown then to take a measurement then again in 6 months to a year's time or 2 years' time, you'd be able to see that reduction. But it's quite a hard question to answer, because fundamentally we have to actually make sure that we kind of actually get this set up to start with to be able to actually generate a score in the first place. But if we were to do this, I would do it in Wales, because we have all the data, we have the methodology, we would trial it in Wales. And then what we would do is, in terms of disability solutions, what I would do is then work in collaboration with disability-based organisations who work within climate change and resilience and disaster risk reduction. There are organisations such as Scope, which do give advice on this in Wales, and basically collaborate with them to see what kind of co-produced solutions we could create in the areas which have higher levels of risk, and then trial those and then rescore and categorise if the data, as providing that all the data is still available and still updated from the previous scoring system. Because that's another problem. You might have the data first off from, let's say, 2023. So you take that, but then the data hasn't been updated since 2023 when you try and take the second score 2 years later, and you're like, well, it's going to produce the same score because you don't have new, more updated data. So it's a combination of, if we were to create a solutions-based report, we would have to then create a refreshed new data set, basically, to be able to calculate that. And in terms of disability solutions, it's really important that we focus on persons with disabilities and climate change. It represents 1 billion people globally. And the fact that a lot of persons with disabilities have been neglected within kind of major organisational infrastructures only until recently. The Global Platform was a good example in Geneva of disability inclusion, because my wonderful friend Marcy helped out the UN DRR in planning that and making sure that there were interpreters, there were captions, there were wheelchair spots. However, before previous global platforms didn't have such good access. And this is 2025. So we really have we are really on ground zero with that. But there is endless opportunities. I mean, for instance, there's an international organisation called the Zero Project, and they do international disaster solutions, but also solutions which remove barriers for particularly persons with disabilities. And they've worked a lot with countries across the globe in awarding awards, £50,000 awards to solutions which work on the local level. And they would be an opportunity, that would be an opportunity to collaborate, because you'd be able to test much better kind of with those case studies which are already operational to see how they could reduce. I mean, I can't propose any solutions right now off the top of my head, because that's quite a difficult thing to do depending on kind of the local cultural context and kind of how disability provision is provided within the specific area of where you're referring to, because each local authority has a completely different structure, benefit system, economic kind of measurement of disability, right to work scheme, you name it. So it is a complex challenge, but that's how I go about doing it. Does that answer the question?
Yes, thank you.
Great.
We're going to have our reception in just 1 minute, so we'll just have one last quick question, and then we'll thank everybody.
Thank you so much for organizing this event and having such a well-rounded panel. I just wanted to ask, because I recently completed my master's on how heat impacted individuals with severe mental illness, which people might know they're more vulnerable in terms of whether it's health disparity, higher rate of mortality within this group of 10 to 20 years than the average population. And I was just wondering, in your indicators, if there is any kind of weightage in which you would prioritize within different groups. For example, if the severe mental illness group might be a higher priority within the indicators, if that makes sense, or whether the elderly population might have a higher weightage in the indices.
So in terms of the weightage of how I applied it, I tried to do it as evenly as possible, because all the factors are so kind of interconnected with one another. If you placed, I found when you placed a certain weighting, it might neglect other elements which sometimes might have unknown kind of positive feedback loops, which then intervene and then could cause greater risk. I did want to put more weighting, but that made it even more complicated to try and add, because I did try and do a mental health approach. I think I sat there for 3 days straight, literally trying to do all the math. And it wasn't easy. That's why I initially proposed it, because also the data of really severe mental illnesses, the granular data, is sometimes not available on health board, even at health board level. They generally just talk about diagnostic rates of overall mental health disorder. So it's really, really difficult to pick apart schizophrenia diagnosis because of patient confidentiality and patient records, and also reporting as well. Which is partly why I didn't want to weight it either, because I didn't want necessarily kind of the friction between all the different kind of indicators to emerge in terms of calculation. But if we had more time and more granular data of different disorder and focused more specifically on specific climatic hazards or extremes, such as heat waves, for instance, I mean, it's an opportunity. But when you're considering all hazards and then trying to make sure that all the different socioeconomic components were in, it was just whoa, my mind's blown. I did sit there with my mind being blown, I think, for about 3 days. But Emma, you probably have a far better answer than me. Go ahead.
No, definitely not a better answer. I was just thinking or reflecting on what both of you said, that I think in a way you're looking, Rhiannon, your index is looking at these different factors at sort of a population level. And at the moment, we don't have enough evidence, I think, to fully weight the different risk in the way that you're sort of suggesting. But I know a little bit, we spoke this morning, actually, so I know some of the work that you're doing is also looking at some of those pathways by which people living with severe mental health conditions are more at risk. And so I'm just saying things that you already know, but to the rest of the audience, in the British heat dome in British Columbia heat dome in Canada in 2021, the condition that was most associated with people dying was schizophrenia. And then Canada has looked into, why is that? What are all of these pathways and mechanisms? And once you start to understand that, then you can start at an individual level to assess as a clinician. And I know you're developing guidance for clinicians, et cetera, to say, well, actually, how do I assess, is this person in front of me, are they prepared? And how, in what ways might they be vulnerable to something like heat? And then how do we address that? So I think there will be the need for both that population level and then that individual level kind of assessment. And I think, yeah, then there'll be some sort of interaction, of course, but thanks.
Okay, so, right, thank you very much, everyone. So I just wanted to end with, there's been lots of lovely comments made online that I'll pass on, Rhiannon. But so thank you to our online audience for all your questions and your comments. But I did want to read out this one, which was not a question, but as one of Rhiannon's PhD supervisors, I just wanted to say a huge well done to Rhiannon for her work on this index and her ongoing PhD research. She's doing an amazing job, and she should be proud of herself, as we all are. Sorry we can't be there in person, but we are here online cheering and supporting you on. All right. So that's a really lovely one from Rhian Thomas and so many other people. So basically, I just want to just wrap up now because I'm basically the person between us and refreshments and some nibbles, which I'm sure you have all thoroughly earned through this thorough, mind-blowing 2-hour session. I've learned so much. So first, I'd like to say thank you very much to all our panelists for coming and being part of this. And as part of this, you will get, I'll give it to you in a minute, but you'll get a Warning Research mechanical pencil, because you just don't have enough of those, and the best mug in the world as well. So you'll grab one of those. So thank you very much for your time. We're all very busy people, so we appreciate you coming to take part in this. Also to Virginia for giving the additional forward. And also to Rhiannon, who I'm so proud of your work. And it's been really lovely working with Rhiannon and to have students, I have many students who are passionate, but it's been really such a pleasure to work with you and your passion and enthusiasm for this work. And this is just the start, so I'm really excited to see where this goes. I also want to thank Amanda, who's become invisible because she's going to check on the reception, because without her, this event would not have happened. We'd also like to thank the tech team, because without them, we can't make this a hybrid event. Even despite COVID, we've still not mastered that we need the tech team support. So thank you very much for that. This event is recorded. It will be online for you to watch in a few days. So if you want other people, you think other people might benefit from this, please do pass on the link. It will be on our YouTube channel. We thank you for joining us in person and online for your engagement in all of this. And I also then just am left to say, oh, no, that's the wrong way. The reception is in C13. So if you come out of this door and turn left, it is in C312. Sorry, what I'm talking about. So this level 3.12. So just on the left here is the reception. And there will be nibbles and drinks, but please do take any coffee or tea or biscuits that are there, because it will go otherwise. So we want to make sure that's being used. And we look forward to seeing you at future events. If you have any feedback on this event that you want to give us, that would be great. We're always looking to enhance and improve our events. But thank you, everyone. And please enjoy the reception now. Thank you.